This is Doug Green, and I'm the publisher of TR Publications, and this is a special podcast for TR Publications and the Cloud Communications Alliance, the CCA. And I have with me today Haydn Faltyn, who's the CEO of BroadSource. Haydn, thank you for joining me today.
Good day, Doug.
And Michael Gliana, who's the CTO of BroadSource. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Doug.
Well, thank you for joining me, and we're going to be talking about a topic we've heard from many different companies, but this is one where we're going to be hearing of some specific issues that are going to be of interest to a lot of our readers. BroadSource is reacting to the heightened amount of people that are working in a distributed form and all the implications that have come with that. So BroadSource is expanding the capability of its EMU software. In this podcast, we're going to learn why and why it's impactful to the service provider community. So before we get going, let's define a few things. Haydn, first of all, what is BroadSource?
Thanks, Doug. Thanks for the opportunity. BroadSource is a global software development and integration company that specializes in UCaaS projects for global service providers. And so BroadSource has cut its teeth for the last 15 to 20 years in developing software to help service providers better manage their subscribers on their UCaaS platforms. Our EMU platform, that is the topic for today's conversation, is our software that allows subscribers to be better managed in terms of the ability to extract information about them, to manipulate information about them, and to update information about them. And what that means for global service providers who offer UCaaS is they now have an array of use cases to manage volume, to manage complexity around their subscriber fleets. Maybe better auditing, better analytics, better provisioning workflows, with a focus particularly nowadays with a change in the way in which the workplace is being constructed into migration to cloud. So the ability to migrate subscribers and to move people around networks in a far more repeatable and automated way. Fundamentally giving service providers the ability to accelerate, to optimize their teams, and to give teams time back instead of doing things from a manual perspective.
So it seems, and as we were discussing in the run-up to this podcast, that a lot of service providers are striving to continually innovate and differentiate their cloud UC offerings by adding new devices to their offerings, or keeping their existing fleets updated with the latest and greatest software capability on those devices. And we certainly see this from companies like Poly or Yealink, Gnome, Grandstream, Cisco, and so on. So are you kind of reacting to that trend?
Yeah, definitely. There's sort of an explosion of new collaboration capabilities on devices that are not only now resident within workplaces and buildings, but also now even in the home office. And the ability to keep connected no matter where you are is not just driven by traditional physical handsets, which are on desks, but also now an array of different devices that now also need to be managed by the service provider, no matter where they are. And we're seeing that service providers have an increasing level of complexity, taking more and more of their day without them really wanting to have to manage this order of magnitude of complexity associated with what could be millions of actual devices spread around their networks. Each one of them, in effect, is a little computer with software and operating systems and firmware and things like that, all running on their networks to be that endpoint on what are progressively growingly larger and larger UCaaS platforms in this new world of cloud-based communications and collaboration.
So Michael, maybe you can explain this a little bit more to me. We have all these workers migrating to home. We have new challenges and apparently maybe new opportunities. So what does this mean, when you're updating your firmware release manager on a technical level?
Yeah, a very good question, Doug. Firmware management on devices used to be one of the very complex tasks that the service providers needed to do for a large number of reasons. One important reason was the devices themselves many times are the face of the product for service providers, because that's where their customers interact with. So to be able to keep those updated, bug-free, and running the latest firmware is paramount important, but a very, very complex tasks, mainly because you're traversing a large number of networks to get to the device, and anything between the service provider's platform and the device itself can impact that process. And nowadays, where during the pandemic, when most people started working from home, and that boundary between office place and home was blurred even further, we see a lot of service providers now started thinking of consolidating their platforms into one that can do more effectively, rather than to segment that across a home user and an office user and things like that. And that means more devices in more places, and even more complexity to manage those devices and manage their firmware. So the task, all of a sudden, it was a very difficult task, and all of a sudden it became a lot more difficult, and the scope of it and the scale of it increased, at least by 2 to 3 folds, and that's what we're seeing in the market. And we think that trend, because of the impact of the COVID-19 and the pandemic, most people will now start working from home. Then that trend will increase, if anything.
So Haydn, it sounds to me like this causes a huge burden on the service providers, who now needs to keep up, not only keeping up with new developments and new capabilities and new offerings, but the need to manage an increasingly complex network that consists of many different devices, probably from different manufacturers and sources, new and legacy. So what triggers a service provider to need to upgrade their fleet of devices?
Yeah, they're kind of passengers, Doug, in some of these instances, and probably the last thing that they want to hear is that one of the handset manufacturers is about to launch a new version of firmware, either to add value to the device, which ultimately benefits the service provider, but it may just be something as benign to the end user as a security patch or something like that warrants a sort of either an emergency update of firmware across 200,000 devices, or the activation of a new feature. All of those things become those things that they are trying to put a lid on. There's no extra revenue to the service provider to have to deploy new versions of firmware. They often can't charge for a brand new feature. It just becomes a part of the status quo in differentiating their offerings. So all of a sudden, these teams are growing inside service providers exponentially, with the sort of the dimensions of more devices, with each device having multiple versions of firmware into different market segments, creates sort of this multiplier effect, which traditionally has only been able to be solved by kind of labor, by teams of people who understood it intimately. And as we know, the UK service provider community, in many respects, has been a beneficiary in terms of growth, and accelerated their growth because of now how people are expected to operate using cloud-based technologies. Those teams are scaling linearly with that platform growth, which is just not viable for service providers.
So Michael, how long and how much effort are we looking at here?
It depends on the size of the deployment and the service providers, but we've seen, service providers with teams of, up to 10 people and sometimes more, just to look after the constantly, upgrading and testing and trying to deploy new firmware to their devices. And so it could get very, very expensive to the service providers, and nowadays we're seeing that trend is growing more and more, largely because of some of the reasons that we've detailed, but also because as those devices become more complicated, then their features become more targeted, and the traditional way of having one device type and one firmware on those devices is no longer valid, because those devices are now very configurable. They're feature rich, so some of their customer base might use certain features, some of them might use totally different set of features demanding different firmware levels. So what was traditionally a complex problem, it's getting even more complex because of the scale, because of the scope, and because of the new capabilities that those devices have, requiring different firmware. So the sizes of those teams is definitely growing in every service provider that we come across, and partly, the reason that we came up with this new capability on EMU is to address that problem.
So Haydn, is there a way to increase the automation, increase the flexibility, and reduce the amount of time and effort keeping the fleet up to date?
Yeah, we've seen service providers probably over the last decade have a crack at developing scripts, have a go at building it themselves, usually bumping into problems for the first time and having to manage their own way to automate, to repeat, and to increase efficiency, to try and save themselves time. And so we decided maybe about 18 months to 2 years ago to again have another attempt at solving what was once thought to be an unsolvable activity, similar to what EMU is achieving in terms of subscriber migrations, which was probably the most complicated thing to achieve, and many said is unsolvable. We started a journey about 18 months ago to solve that unbelievably complex process of all the different reasons that service providers have to think through in them needing to deliver new firmware to their subscribers and their devices, which is a very complicated process at an individual service provider level, but then across all the different service providers across the globe who have UCaaS problems, each has their own variant of that. And so that task was given to Mike and his development team to solve, and we've solved it via EMU's ability to now manage firmware distribution management and policy management, and to create a whole lot of repeatability, a whole lot of time saving for the teams inside service providers to manage the onslaught that's occurring before their eyes. And EMU's now got the ability, of which a number of customers of ours have already deployed, to try and allow them to scale their teams non-linearly with the number of subscribers that they're attracting to their cloud services. And so EMU is the engine now that powers the teams to be efficient, to be flexible, to be very customer responsive. I think is probably also a key thing to allow them then to differentiate. No longer is a firmware deployment project that grind that sort of ended up impacting the customer as well. And all of a sudden there were these conversations between the service provider and the customer about, okay, we've got to do an upgrade again. So now EMU is looking after all of that complexity for them.
It sounds to me like this puts the service provider, first of all, in a position of more control over what's happening.
Definitely. Yeah. I think we've all heard the stories of aborted and failed upgrade attempts, not only on a given night, but over elongated periods. So EMU's design principle was about exactly that, about giving them the policies, to articulate what those policies need to be, to allow them to control in a far better way the way in which firmware is distributed around the network. Mike, did you want to talk about some of those policies that sort of gave them more control?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Haydn said, there was a number of things that made this process very complicated. The first one was the policies that determine who gets upgraded and when, and because most of the time the devices that control the systems that control the devices and their firmware are separate to the systems that control the calling, and one system doesn't have the visibility of the other. So one traditional problem is, not being able to segment who gets upgraded when. It was either all or nothing, and in many times, they could segment it to a certain market segment, but not anything lower than that. With EMU, it's very easy to create pilot groups and pilot users to target to upgrade first, and then control the policy of when the upgrade happens, and who gets upgraded. The other traditional problem in that process was, once the upgrade process happened, there was no way of knowing the progress of that process, because there is no control over the physical devices themselves, and no knowledge of their state during that upgrade, and even after the upgrade. So many times the service providers had to rely on either calling customers, or waiting for the customers to call back and say, well, their devices, they're not operational anymore, or they haven't upgraded, and things like that. And EMU solve that problem of reporting by exactly knowing the state of the devices during the upgrade and after the upgrade, to determine whether the upgrade was successful or not. And if there were any exceptions to, any devices that didn't upgrade properly, a list of those devices for further handling. So it addresses not just the complexity of having to manage lots and lots of configuration files and tags, but also the complexity of the operational process aspects of the upgrade, in terms of, before the upgrade, during the upgrade, and what happens after the upgrade as well.
So, Haydn, as we come to the close of our podcast today, is there a big overarching message that you want to send out to the service provider community?
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and appreciate the opportunity to introduce EMU and the firmware management distribution capability now that's in market. We'd like to let the service provider community know that while the teams inside their businesses are scrambling to keep up with the enormous transition of the workforce to cloud collaboration and cloud unified communications platforms, there are ways to automate and to improve the efficiency and accuracy of their teams as their platforms expand enormously. It's irrefutable that telephony and collaboration and teamwork is now a part of cloud systems and solutions, and that we are working really hard as the EMU product development team to look for opportunities to give back time to improve their accuracy and performance of these teams. And we just encourage them to have a think about how they do things today, and how we can help make those teams more productive. They can benefit from the logic and the policies and the accuracy of what EMU is doing for service providers around the globe, and allow them to scale from a subscriber perspective, but also scale through higher levels of sort of intelligent automation within their environments to cope with those demands that are now being placed on them every single day. So that's probably how we'd like to help, and what some of the big pictures are in this UCaaS environment that we're trying to address every other day.
And Michael, it sounds like, leaning on what Haydn's just said, that BroadSource has really brought to the market a way to address these issues, and where people can really leverage what you've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we try to do what many thought was very hard and nearly impossible, but I think we've done it again, and you know, we would love the service providers to you know, to take advantage of that, because we know it's a headache for every service provider out there, and we know it's a growing headache for them, and we would love to be able to remove that headache, and by using EMU, and we think that we can. So we'd love the service provider to take advantage of that.
Well, Michael and also Haydn, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been very interesting, and I think the service provider community will certainly be looking and studying this podcast. Where can we learn more?
Thanks, Doug. So clearly, we're part of the Cloud Communications Alliance, and our friends and colleagues and customers we spend time with in the CCA is where we would like to communicate more about these new innovations from BroadSource on the EMU platform. Equally, BroadSource has put some dedicated material up onto our website that does describe these issues that we believe every single service provider is currently being confronted with. And so at broadsource.com.au, you'll find some dedicated material about the firmware distribution management capability of EMU now. I'd be more than happy to share some white papers that you'll be able to find on our website. Probably the two main places in which we'd like to interact with our SP customers. Doug?
Well, this is an ongoing issue, so I know we'll be talking about this in the future, but for now, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Doug. A pleasure.